And then came the invitation to Balmoral, which reduced Elspeth to a state of nervous exaltation close to hysterics, and took me clean aback. I'd have imagined that if the royal family ever thought of me at all, it was as the chap who'd been remiss enough to lose one of the Queen's cousins. But, mind you, she had so many of them she probably didn't notice, and if she did, hadn't heard that I was to blame for it. No, I've puzzled over it sometimes, and can only conclude that the reason we were bidden to Balmoral that September was that Russia was still very much the topic of the day, what with the new Tsar's coronation and the recent peace, and I was one of the most senior men to have been a prisoner in Russia's hands. I didn't have leisure to speculate at the time, though, for Elspeth's frenzy at the thought of being in attendance, as she chose to call it, claimed everyone's attention within a mile of Berkeley Square. Being a Scotch tradesman's daughter, my darling was 1 degree more snobbish than a penniless Spanish duke, and in the days before we went north, her condescension to her middle-class friends would have turned your stomach. Between gloating and babbling about how she and the Queen would discuss dressmaking while Albert and I boozed in the gun-room — she had a marvellous notion of court life, you see — she went into declines at the thought that she would come out in spots or have her drawers fall down when being presented. You must have endured the same sort of thing yourself. "Oh, Harry, Jane's Speedicut will be green. You and I guests of Her Majesty. It will be the finest thing, and I have my new French dresses, the ivory, the beige silk, the lilac satin, and the lovely, lovely green which old Admiral Lawson so admired, if you think it is not a little low for the Queen, and my barège for Sunday. Will there be members of the nobility staying also? Will there be ladies whose husbands are of lower rank than you?" Ellen Parkin, Lady Parkin indeed, was consumed with spite when I told her. Oh, and I must have another maid who can manage my hair, for Sarah is too maladroit for words, although she's very passable with dresses. What shall I wear to picnics? For we shall be bound to walk in the lovely Highland countryside. Oh, Harry, what do you suppose the Queen reads? And shall I call the Prince Highness or Sir? I was glad, I can tell you, when we finally reached Abergeldy, where we had rooms in the castle where guests were put up, for Balmoral was very new then, and Albert was still busy having the finishing touches put to it. Elspeth by this time was too nervous even to talk, but her first glimpse of our royal hosts reduced her awe a trifle, I think. We took a stroll on the first afternoon in the direction of Balmoral, and on the road encountered what seemed to be a family of tinkers, led by a small washerwoman and an usher who had evidently pinched his headmaster's clothes. Fortunately, I recognized them as Victoria and Albert out with their brood, and knew enough simply to raise my hat as we passed, for they loathed to be treated as royalty when they were playing at being commoners. Elspeth didn't even suspect who it was until we were past, and when I told her, she swooned by the roadside. I revived her by threatening to carry her into the bushes and molest her, and on the way back she observed that really Her Majesty had looked quite royal, but in a common sort of way. By the time we were presented at Balmoral, though, the next day, she was high up in the scale again, and the fact that we shared the waiting-room beforehand with some lord or other and his beak-nosed lady, who looked at us as though we were riff-raff, reduced my poor little scatterbrain to quaking terror. I'd met the royals before, of course, and tried to reassure her, whispering that she looked a stunner, which was true, and not to be put off by Lord and Lady Puff-Buttock, who were now ignoring us with that icy incivility which is the stamp of our lower-class aristocracy. I know, I'm one myself nowadays. It was quite handy that our companions kept their noses in the air, though, for it gave me a chance to loop a ribbon from the lady's enormous crinoline onto an occasional table without her knowing, and when the doors to the royal drawing-room were opened, she set off and brought the whole thing crashing down, crockery and all, in full view of the little court circle. I kept Elspeth in an iron grip and steered her round the wreckage, and so Colonel and Mrs. Flashman made their bows, while the doors were hurriedly closed behind us, and the muffled sounds of the puff-buttocks being extricated by flunkies was music to my ears, even if it did make the Queen look more pop-eyed than usual. The moral is, don't put on airs with Flashy, and if you do, keep your crinolines out of harm's way.